You're old. You keep saying that. Oh, well, I wouldn't want to drag on. Is this a D's nuts joke? No, I was calling you an elder dragon, but now I feel bad. Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, when it comes to this series, we are all connected by our love of one thing above all else, the monsters. The weapons are cool, the combat is fun, but the thing that keeps us coming back time after time is the unstoppable barrage of incredibly unique, whimsical, badass, silly, and just generally extremely high quality concepts for the monsters of this series, and the generally very high standard of execution when it comes to putting them in the game and bringing their movesets to life too, especially as time has gone on and the newer generations have been able to make more use of the technology of the times. That said, there is one specific subset of monsters that often gets a bit of extra attention, and that is the Elder Dragons, a specific categorization that denotes monsters that are either extremely powerful or too biologically unique to fit into any other existing category. And so today, now that Sunbreak is completely done and dusted, no new things being added, I thought it would be a fun time to do a new updated tier list for all 50 Elder Dragons that are currently part of the main series, updated to include things like the Risen Monsters and Primordial Malzeno and such too. A note before we begin, there are 50 monsters in consideration here, but some of these, especially the ones from earlier generations, do have subspecies that I only consider slight differences in my mind, and so if I don't make a point of mentioning otherwise, if a monster and its subspecies are directly next to each other on the list, assume that I just consider them a small enough change that the position doesn't really move for me between them. With that said, let's dive right in on the bottom with the F tier, where I have the Laoshan Lungs. Big, relatively peaceful lizards just trying to get from point A to point B the easiest way that they know how, causing notable levels of destruction just due to the sheer size of their body. I dig the concept on a base level, but I think they just sort of are lost in time. There have been much cooler versions of the old peaceful monster that causes unintended destruction concept, and they have been done in far more unique ways, and Laoshan Lung has never really gotten a properly updated fight in the main series. Yes, it was in Generations Ultimate and had some changes, but it still just completely pales in comparison to a siege fight where you can actually fight a monster, and so that's it really for me. I just consider the fight to be quite stale and boring in its current incarnations, and the concept to be relatively tame by Monster Hunter standards, and I don't really like the visuals of it all that much either. Then moving up to the D tier, we have Rusted Kushala Daora. This version of the monster just emphasizes all of its worst parts to me. In theory, it spends more time on the ground than in the air compared to normal Kushala, but in practice, it still spends a ton of time in the air and just moving around, making it really hard for you to do actual meaningful damage to it. The concept of this one is neat, but it is an alternate version of Kushala Daora that simply has not been allowed to update to the modern era. And while I think modern Kushala himself as a base monster is much better, this unfortunately does leave Rust version quite a bit far behind. Then we have Zora Magdaros, very cool concept, volcanic magma turtle just wandering about. Again, a similar concept to Lao, where he doesn't necessarily want to hurt things or destroy places, he just sort of does it by moving from one place to another. The cinematic nature of your encounters with this as well, as the concept being a fair bit cooler than Lao's, have bumped it up to this tier instead, but I still consider the fight itself to be quite a letdown given how cool it could be in theory. After that, I've got the big old grouping of all of the Morans together. I didn't consider their differences to be particularly meaningful enough to make any of them better than each other. I more just consider them variations created as an excuse to take more stabs at the concept of a sandship siege fight. And while I think that concept is quite cool, the actual execution would probably be much better in the modern era of monster hunting, and the concepts for the monsters themselves are all just sort of to me, which is why I've not even split them into different entries. They're a bit bland. Big old sandworms swimming through the desert, that's something that every sci-fi series has done at least once in some way. Then we move on up to the C tier, and starting off, I have Kulve Taroth. From here on up, I don't think anything is bad by any means, but the point of a tier list is comparison, and so I just think that everything in this tier is notably better than the monsters in the previous tier, but not quite as good as the ones that follow it either. Kulve is a very cool monster then, a big old golden dragon that sort of just looks like a giant oversized Jagras, and the whole map and entire siege concept created to back her up were all quite cool too. The fight itself, while being a spectacle and a half, was not the most intricate as far as how you actually deal with her and combat what she does, and unfortunately the nature of the whole thing was that you were incentivized to farm Kulve and only Kulve for what felt like months on end, which resulted in a lot of people getting a bit soured on the feeling of that whole fight and the full lobby siege mechanics that came along with it. It wasn't bad by any means, but it was a first attempt at a new type of siege system that I think they heavily improved upon the next time it was tried. After that is Crimson Fatalis. Visually cool, lore-wise very imposing, but unlike its standard cousin, Crimson has not gotten an updated fight yet in the 5th generation, and I really just personally have no care at all for the old generation Fatalis fights as a whole. They just don't interest me all that much. Same goes with old Fatalis, who I have here really. I would put him the slightest bit above Crimson for the cool super attack that he has, but the fights just don't do it for me, which leaves them down here. Then we have Nikarchos. I think Nikarchos is pretty cool. I like how they handled his story encounters in multiple stages of reveals, and his fight is actually pretty fun too. I'm not sure what it is about him, but he just sort of never properly clicked with me personally in a way where I enjoy the fight too much myself. Maybe it was just the feeling of fighting the tentacles or that one splotch of a weak point. It almost felt like I was attacking a turtle's shell rather than the turtle itself, which does feel a little bit odd to me. Then we have Velkhana. Very cool concept, beautiful monster, interesting fight for the most part, but I've said it before and I'll say it again and again until it one day hopefully changes in a future Monster Hunter game. The fact that as a monster, she can create walls of ice the player cannot physically move through, but she also fires a beam of ice that can travel through these physically blocking walls without breaking them and then hit you through them, even if you're behind them, is just such a massive mistake. It may seem small on the surface as a singular interaction, but it causes so much frustration for me every time that it happens that it genuinely lowers this monster down a tier for me because of the frustration that happens when this occurs, and it occurs relatively frequently. After that, we get to move on to the B tier, which I have starting off with Kirin. The more I play Monster Hunter, the more I appreciate Kirin itself. It was added in so early in the series for something as unique as it is. I mean, how many large monsters are even that size in the first place? Not to mention ones that you can consider a genuine threat. The fact that its power comes entirely from its elemental control, and it's just such a weak creature without that, it just fills a really fun niche, and it makes Kirin sort of the poster child of the thunder element in a way that I find very cool. Yes, the fight can be irritating, especially when it enrages, and most of its body is quite low hit zone, even though it can be hard to hit specific parts on something quite that small, but I think that is what makes it even out around this spot for me. Then we have Kushala Daora, and this is because I think they made some really solid improvements to his fight in Rise and Sunbreak. I've always thought that Kushala was a super cool concept as a dragon, basically a metallic creature that creates wind with the flaps of his overly hefty body due to the metal scales. The sound it makes, all of it, just a very cool concept, but until Rise and Sunbreak, the fight itself was just irritating to take part in to me, but I think the updated version of this monster has simply improved significantly. Then we have Teostra, and I think he is just a super solid Elder Dragon. The concept isn't completely unheard of in other games before this, a fiery, demonic, almost lion-type dragon. He's got blast shenanigans as well, and I do like his Rise iteration quite a bit too. I think he is almost like the just sort of solid template of this is what an Elder Dragon should be on average to begin with. If it's worse than this, it's not worth being an Elder Dragon. Not irritating, not a pushover, cool concepts, even if not completely unique, and I think also importantly, he is very buildable for alternate versions to get more interesting. After that, I've got Xeno'jiiva, incredible spectacle monster, very cool experience, extremely low replay value though. After that first couple of times experiencing the whole thing, it just becomes a bit of a boring damage sponge. Concept-wise, the idea of it being a super young version of a ridiculously powerful creature is a very interesting idea though, and that combined with just how beautiful both the creature itself is and the spectacle of the fight is what brings this back up to being B tier for me even so. After that, we have Dire Morales' ass. Sorry for that crop.
I'm just not comfortable with this.
And Dire Morales, I think, is one that is conceptually just absolutely awesome. Visually, it is badass as hell. The lore around it is literally just ending all life in the oceans that it passes through by passively raising the temperature of a massive body of water just by existing. It's all extremely cool. And if this tier list was on concepts alone, it would probably be near the top. But the fight is definitely not the most engaging on this list by any means, and hopefully one day they will remake him and bring him into the modern games and he'll have a fight worthy of how cool he is as a creature. But as it currently stands, I've got to keep him down here in the B tier. Then moving on, we have Wind Serpent Ibushi. He's pretty neat. I like the idea of the shape of these monsters being quite funky and the way that they just sort of float around, which is fun, but fight-wise, I think he just sort of pales in comparison to his companion, which unfortunately with the rather direct comparison, them being just so soon after each other in the same game, sort of leaves him down a tier for me. After that, wrapping up this tier, we have both Dalamadur and Shah Dalamadur. Both of these are conceptually extremely cool. I mean, snakes are awesome, and they're just inconceivably large snakes with sharp little bits coming off of them at every angle that let them burrow through entire mountains. I've always loved the concept of this monster, but for the most part, I thought that the concept outweighed the fight on this one. But now that I've actually experienced the fight a few times for myself, I can officially say that it is a bit of a snooze fest. It's not very fun. It doesn't really take advantage of what the creature is, so it has come down a bit in ranking for me since then, but I still think the concept alone carries it to this tier at least, and hopefully one day we'll have some sort of a remake or a rego flow at this fight that will really improve the way that it feels. After that, we move on to the A tier, which is starting off with Gogmazios, a giant creature absolutely dripping with hot tar. He's got the literal first dragon eater that was ever created lodged in his body, and you can not only break it out by breaking his parts, but you can then activate it on the floor to hit him with it, which then makes the fight way more interesting than most siege encounters already just by itself. He is one of the largest properly fightable monsters, and he's just conceptually and visually extremely cool, so I put him on this tier, a little bit of a step up from my old feelings on him, simply because my opinion has improved after experiencing the fight properly for myself in its story context. Then we have Thunder Serpent Narwa, a very cool creature, pretty looking, lovely colors, nice effects, and one of the more engaging spectacle monsters that they've created, with a lot of actual interaction in the fight too. Just a very solid creature all around that would be in a higher tier if it wasn't for another version of it simply being better in my eyes. Then we have Valhazak, conceptually extremely cool creature again. The fight is fun, if not unusually a bit easy for an Elder Dragon, as he has a lot of long, winding up telegraphs and slow animations that make him relatively quite easy to dodge. Even so though, I think his fight is still fun, even if it's easy. I love the concept of look of him in the first place too. Moving on, we have Sadeas and Goldbeard Sadeas. I still think this is an absolutely beautiful creature, gorgeous looking. I love whales, I love the horns and the beard aesthetic as well. I love the lore behind him and how he isn't truly aggressive so much as just in pain because of his horns growing over his eyes and causing him issues as a result, so he headbutts the wall of the sea, which is causing what are basically giant earthquakes. But his fight is a bit irritating, partially due to being underwater, partially due to him being so damn big, and partially just because he moves a lot for something that is that big that we have to deal with the underwater movement, which is what brings it down to only being in the A tier. After that, we have Arashi Kirin. I just think it's better than Kirin, hands down. Conceptually, it's very similar. Visually, I like the color scheme more, and fight and moveset wise, I think it's just a lot more interesting to see all of these ideas and concepts happen with an ice theme rather than a thunder team. It's a lot more creative feeling. It just feels a lot better in an imaginative way that I quite enjoyed. Then we have Valstrax, just base Valstrax. I think he's awesome, don't get me wrong. A bit difficult to explain within the realistic side of the lore of Monster Hunter, but sometimes you have to just let the cool factor suspend your disbelief, and this is definitely one of those moments. He's only down on A tier though because I like his other versions more, and there had to be some distinction made here between them. Following that is Shagaru Magala. I've never been the biggest Gore or Shagaru fanboy myself personally. I think they're cool, I think they're visually neat, I think the way that they fold into the story of the 4th generation is very fun, and I think Shagaru's moveset is pretty fun too, especially the way that it was brought back into Sunbreak. I don't have any negative feelings here really, but the lack of personal attachment, for me, is what leaves it here even so. Moving on then is Safi Jiva. I think this is where they really got a better handle on the 16-player siege concept. It really fits it, I think it adds in an interesting layer. The concept of it being an adult Xenojiva is really fun too, and it has some of the coolest animation effects in the series, with Sapphire of the Emperor being just an absolutely incredible, unforgettable moment. It still also just fights like a normal Monster Hunter encounter too, without any of the limitations of old-gen spectacle fights, which is just fantastic, and with the creature being a bit big and having some bonus mechanics, which makes it solid too. I still do, to this day, wish it had black scales instead of a sort of pale red, but that is a very minor nitpick, honestly, compared to everything else I've just praised. After that, finishing off the A tier is Runer Nergigante. I really do like Runer. I think he has a lot of overlap with the reasons that I like base Nergigante, but I do like him slightly less for 2 reasons. One, he is much more oppressive in combat than regular Nergi. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but just the flow of the fight is less enjoyable to me, not by a massive amount, but the bigger thing for me here is the metallic spikes. Part of why I like Nergigante is he just feels like a hedgehog that accidentally became a dragon, like being cursed by a witch or something, whereas Runer feels like it was more of a government experiment, Wolverine type deal, where he wanted to improve himself, so he somehow managed to attach metal to his bones, and it just clicks with me a touch less than regular Nergi. Still a super solid monster though. Then we go into our S tier for the day, and this is starting off with, well, regular Nergigante. I don't think the distance between the two of them is massive, but it is just the right amount to go from one tier to the next tier. Regular Nergi holds a special place in my heart, with World being my first Monster Hunter game, but I also still just love the learnability of the fight, the way that it seems super imposing at first, but once you understand the spike break mechanics, it becomes instantly much easier. It's just a lovely Elder Dragon to introduce to new players, while also just rewarding you with more cinematic and efficient hunts the more that you understand him and his fight, and of course, aesthetically, he's just awesome. After that then comes Geismagorn, who has an extremely memorable fight, some extremely cool cutscenes as well surrounding him, but he just never quite vibed with me on a visual level. I think he is very cool visually, don't get me wrong, I love where he fits in the story, and I think his fight is genuinely very solid, especially as a spectacle final boss type monster, but the visuals just feel so strangely alien to me that it's hard for my brain to accept it as a Monster Hunter creature in a weird way. That doesn't take away from it at all as a general thing, but it is why it is an S tier for me personally rather than all the way at the top. Then we have Allmother Narwa, the super special proper final boss version of the creature after it powers up from meeting her old pal Ibushi. This is just such a notable increase in quality and mechanics compared to either of the other new elders from Rise itself. It's very similar to what I said about Narwa, but just increase in quality across the board, increased cinematicness, and a number of very cool special attacks and moments added in as well. Following that up, we have Lunastra, and this is definitely a personal one. I just think that Lunastra is an extremely beautiful design for an Elder Dragon. Going in on the whole blue flame thing, the bond attack with Teostra is really cool and unique as well, and then the actual fight she was given in the modern games is just incredible to me. I know it's one that a lot of people get irritated with, but I love all the little nuances to it. The fact that you require cool drinks, the fact that her flame walls can actually block projectiles like arrows, the way her fire just sort of chains and combos and waves across an entire zone if you let it. It all just makes fighting her feel very big and dramatic, and I enjoyed just a hell of a lot, personally. Moving on from that then is Chameleos. I think he is conceptually one of the coolest elders. He's very unique in his general design as well. The playing around with the invisibility and mist as a concept is very cool. I'm just not a big fan of dealing with poison in general as a status, so that's more of a personal thing, but then he brings it back by having the tongue whip stealing mechanics, which is just such a lovely touch. And again, the only reason he's not all the way at the top here is that there's just a variation of him that I think is decisively better. After that, we have Malzeno, and a lot of people just quite enjoy this monster, myself included. He's not quite one of my favorites personally, but I have a significant amount of appreciation for him regardless. I love the whole Three Lords theme, and the fact that he represents a vampire and has some vampiric tropes worked into his animations and such, without just becoming a literal vampire. There is still a lot of actual creative and imagination things that went into him, into making him what he is. His moveset is also just very enjoyable to play against, no complaints. Again, I just think there was a better version of him still left to talk about. Then we have Risen Teostra. Not too much to say here that I didn't say about normal Teostra, except that I think he looks significantly better with Risen mode. The whole orange motif really fits him particularly, and I love the way that the Risen mode simply improves what his fight already was without making it feel ridiculously different. Just straight up improvement to me. Following that is Risen Shagaru. Again, I just think it feels better in general. The fight is faster paced, more dangerous, and aesthetically I do love orange as a color, so again I feel like he just looks straight up better too. Moving on from there, we have Black Veil Val Hazak. Once more, just a lot of similar things that I liked about regular Val, except I think the concept of this one is just more interesting, involving the mushrooms and the spores. I love the way that it changes the entire vibe of the ancient forest when he's on the map, and the moveset does get notably more dangerous too without becoming unfun in any specific way, which is great. After that, we have Crimson Glow Valstrax. For all intents and purposes, he's just Valstrax with an enhanced moveset and a bit more focus on the dragon energy, which does also make him look a bit cooler in my opinion. This one isn't all that deep. Then we have Big Papa Fatalis. His reintroduction and recreation in Iceborne has done him some absolute wonders. I do still feel like he looks a bit too much like a basic dragon for how imaginative Monster Hunter does get, but that said, he's an extremely good looking version of a basic dragon. Very, very imposing, and his fight is now absolutely top tier. It's difficult to tell by Monster Hunter standards, but it feels very rewarding too. It doesn't feel like overly artificial difficulty, so much as just a nice, challenging fight to overcome. And I think it is just an extremely solid example of a rework being done to an old, sort of stale feeling monster and bringing it back in a way that makes it top tier even by modern standards. That ends off our S tier then, so now we get to go to the real cream of the crop, the S+ tier monsters. Starting off with my personal favorite Elder Dragon, Namielle. She's just about as perfect as it gets. Conceptually, the idea of a deep sea creature that's been given legs and wings and living on land, but her environment as well is an ocean that was dried up to create a landlocked sort of coral reef. It feels so perfect as an absolutely wonderful conceptual match. Visually speaking, she is both absolutely beautiful and absolutely terrifying, depending on just how close up you get to her face. And I absolutely adore the way that her fight mixes water as far as shooting out waves and beams, even moving the player around with it physically, as well as using electricity to detonate the water in little steam explosions, and of course the big zone change super attack where she jumps all her water in a zone and then blows it up in one go. It's just a near perfect monster in my eyes. Following that up is Shara Ishvalda, and again, this is just near perfect to me. A really, really aesthetically interesting creature, an absolutely spot-on spectacle fight, going from the full rock golem mode that completely confuses you the first time you see it, into the tree demon mode, which can strike fear directly into your heart in an instant, attacking using vibrations in the air itself, with which it can also do things like turn sand into a liquid momentarily, create Death Star beams and spirit bombs. It's just an absolutely unforgettable fight that makes me really happy anytime I think of it. Moving on after that is Yamasukami. I just love his squishy little orb body, a big floating spherical balloon octopus who doesn't intend to hurt anyone, but does simply by sucking in entire ecosystems into his mouth in search of nutrient-rich soil. It's just such a perfect perfect creature in concept and visually that I can absolutely forgive his fight being a bit subpar. But even then, when you consider it being a second generation fight, it's actually quite involved for a monster of his size and position. And with Yama-Kurai existing in Frontier as a sort of example of what it would be like to fight Yamasukami in a more open world setting in a more modern game, it does absolutely lean me towards thinking if he was brought back in a modern game, he'd have an absolutely exceptional fight too. After that is Amatsu, who got a massive bump from the reintroduction in Sunbreak. I've always thought this monster was conceptually very cool and visually interesting, but Sunbreak really added some wonderful accents to the right places to make it one of the prettiest Elder Dragons of all, in my opinion, as well as expanded upon the fight a significant amount to make it an absolute spectacle on its own right that still has a very fightable monster in the middle of it with a very fun moveset to engage with. Every bit of it is fun, it looks cool as hell, and I just have nothing negative at all really to say, all positives, and all very positive too. Then we have Elatrion, who has grown on me even more over time. I think he is aesthetically absolutely badass, and conceptually, being an Elder Dragon who controls all elements, not just a little bit, but to the point of being supposedly a top-level user of all 5 of them simultaneously, is very cool. And the Iceborne fight that he has is just awesome too. If you completely remove the element damage requirement of the fight, I think it is one of the best flowing, enjoyable, and creative movesets that they've ever given a creature. Then they put the elemental damage requirement on top of that, which I don't really mind myself. Yes, it's a bit odd for Monster Hunter to do something like that, but I don't consider it a negative so much as just an interesting mechanic they played around with and they took a shot at. They tried, right? Either way, the fight itself and the design of the monster easily carry past any problems that I could have with that. Following that, we have Risen, Crimson Glow, Valstrax. The Risen sections of these are going to be generally quite simple and familiar because I generally think every Risen monster that was added is an improvement over its base version. I think the Risen aesthetic just looks good on every monster that they put it on, and I think the movesets as a whole were simply improved with any of the changes that they made. That said, Risen Crimson Glow Valstrax has an incredibly challenging fight, but also a very fun one, and I think it's just the best version of one of the already best Elder Dragons. Moving on, we have Primordial Malzeno, and this is just a very solid step up from regular Malzeno. It adds a fair bit to the lore of the concept of the monster, and the whole idea that it is fighting aggressively against the Curios with one form, where it's just this regal protector of the land, and another where it gets sort of taken over and thrown into a frenzy by the Curios trying to take control of it. It was a very beautiful way to sort of cap off the story of it all and give us a pure upgrade to an already beloved new monster. Not to mention the fight is definitely quite a challenge without feeling bullshit at any point either. After that, we have our last two, and you may have guessed it based on what should be left, but they're both Risen monsters. First, we have Risen Chameleos. I have regular Chameleos in S tier, so I don't consider it an actually ridiculous bump up by any means, but I do think it is one tier worthy of change, and I really do enjoy all the changes made to the Risen moveset for this monster, as well as the visual changes that came with it too. It's just a solid improvement across the board. Then our last monster of the day is going to be Risen Kushala Daora, and I love how far the versions of this monster are on this list from each other. We have Rusted Kushala in D tier for never being updated from old game Kushala's pure pain. Then we have regular Kushala in B tier because of the improvements that were made in Rise and then Sunbreak, and then for whatever reason, I just consider Risen Kushala to be such an even further improvement that it goes all the way in the highest tier. I mean, visually speaking, I think Risen mode has a uniquely incredible effect on a monster that normally has so little color going for it, but also the moveset just feels incredible to play against. It doesn't become the most challenging thing in the world, but the pacing of the fight just feels so spot on. It lines up with player attack timings, it lines up with your movement, your silk binds, your movement abilities. It just flows so beautifully into the combat of what Sunbreak is that it has made me gain a much larger appreciation for Kushala as a whole, and it's honestly a shame that we'll probably never see Risen monsters again, but here's hoping that they work in some of the special attacks from Risen mode into these monsters based versions in the future, or just take some of the concepts from it as a whole. And that just about does it then, everyone. 50 Elder Dragons sorted through 7 tiers, worst to best, and of course at the end of the day this is all my opinions. You are free to disagree, and if you do, let me know down in the comments where you think I went wrong. But I'm quite happy with this list for myself, and I do always like doing these after substantial enough changes have happened to the series. It helps me just keep track in my own head of what I really do like more than anything else. I hope you've all enjoyed me going through this list then. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.